Tonight, we're heading back, way back to ancient Egypt. You know, the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and enough gold to make a dragon blush. But while the kings were busy commissioning statues of themselves and naming cities after their cats, someone had to do the actual work. And spoiler alert, it wasn't the guy in the golden mask. This story isn't about the glory. It's about the grime, the back-breaking, soul-sapping, sun-scorched jobs that made Egypt run while making a lot of backs ache. But before we start, if you enjoy these history narrations, don't forget to subscribe. And also tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. We love seeing how far our history travels. Now let's begin. Ancient Egypt, land of gold and greatness, but only if you were rich. If you were poor, your daily routine involved less, admiring the Nile, and more, hauling mud bricks in 110-degree heat while being yelled at by a man in eyeliner. The grandeur of temples and tombs didn't build itself. It was carved, hauled, and stacked by people whose names never made it onto the monuments. While the elite were busy being mummified in style, the workers were lucky if they got paid in bread and beer. And even luckier if the beer wasn't mostly river water. Beneath every pyramid, 1,000 forgotten lives. Not literally, of course. Unless you count the poor souls who got buried in sandstorms or fell into a limestone trench while trying to haul a 2.5-ton block uphill with nothing but rope, sweat, and a supervisor yelling, "Festa," in ancient Egyptian. But metaphorically. Oh yes. For every golden sarcophagus and alabaster perfume jar, there were hundreds, thousands, of workers, artisans, cooks, brewers, scribes, and unfortunate dung collectors who made the whole glittering machine run. Let's talk about the pyramid builders. Not slaves, as once believed of Hollywood. We're looking at you, but conscripted laborers, peasants who were volunteered during the agricultural off-season. Because when the Nile flooded your fields, you had two options: sit at home and watch your mud hut slowly mold, or go to Giza and spend 3 months dragging rocks in the sun while being paid in bread, beer, and the occasional fish head. Guess which one came with a dental plan? Spoiler, neither. These workers lived in nearby labor villages, organized, efficient, and surprisingly well fed. Archaeological digs have found evidence of meat, beer, and even medical care. But don't let that fool you into thinking it was a spa retreat. Their daily routine involved hauling limestone blocks up ramps, chiseling stone in the heat, and trying not to get flattened by a runaway sled. And if you broke a bone, congratulations, you just became part of the pyramid's foundation crew. Then there were the artisans, highly skilled, underappreciated, and probably very tired. These were the folks who carved hieroglyphs, painted tomb walls, and made sure the pharaoh's afterlife looked like a 5-star resort. They worked in cramped tombs with oil lamps, inhaling pigment dust and muttering things like, "If I have to paint one more lotus flower, I swear to Ra." And let's not forget the embalmers. Oh, the embalmers. Imagine spending your days removing organs, drying corpses with natron, kind of ancient baking soda, and stuffing the body with linen and spices like a very morbid Thanksgiving turkey. It was a sacred job, yes, but also one that involved a lot of bodily fluids and very little appreciation. You didn't get a statue for embalming the pharaoh. You got a sinus infection and a weird smell that never quite washed off. Meanwhile, someone had to clean the temple floors, feed the sacred cats, and make sure the priests' wigs were properly fluffed. These were the invisible hands of Egypt, the ones who didn't get their names carved in stone, but without whom the whole divine operation would have collapsed faster than a mud brick wall in a rainstorm. So, while the pharaohs were busy commissioning obelisks and declaring themselves gods, the real engine of Egypt was powered by the Kalaust, sunburned, and occasionally sarcastic masses who built, carved, cooked, and cleaned their way through history. This is not the story of pharaohs. It's the story of those who bled behind the marble and died without names. The ones who didn't get tombs just saw backs and a vague hope that maybe, their kids wouldn't have to spend their lives chiseling hieroglyphs about someone else's greatness. These were the people who made Egypt work, the invisible gears behind the golden mask. They didn't get statues. They got blisters. They didn't get songs. They got shouted at by foremen with sandals and superiority complexes. These were the men and women who hauled, hammered, stitched, stirred, and swept. The ones who built the temples but weren't allowed inside. Who carved the gods but couldn't afford to pray to them. Who painted the afterlife while wondering if they'd get a decent meal in this one. Their lives were measured in tasks, not titles. Their legacy, dust mostly, and maybe a broken tool buried in the sand, waiting for some future archaeologist to say, looks like someone had a bad day. They were the cooks who fed the priests, the potters who made the jars, the scribes who copied the same spell 400 times until their hands cramped into claws. They were the ones who patched the linen, cleaned the latrines, and tried not to inhale too much incense while scrubbing the temple floors. They were the reason Egypt gleamed, just not in the places anyone bothered to look. And among them, perhaps the most underappreciated of all, was a figure who walked the streets before the sun dared rise. No gold, no glory, just a woven basket, a strong stomach, and a job that truly stank. The dung collector, roaming the streets before sunrise with a woven basket. That was the glamorous morning routine of the ancient Egyptian dung collector. A job so fragrant, it made embalming look like a spa day. While the city still slept, and the Nile mist clung to the mud brick walls, these unsung heroes of hygiene shuffled through alleyways and temple courtyards, armed with nothing but a basket, a stick, and a nose that had long since given up. Their mission: to scoop up the daily offerings left behind by donkeys, oxen, stray dogs, and yes, humans. Ancient cities didn't have plumbing. They had corners. And if you were lucky, a communal pit. If you were unlucky, your neighbor had a weak aim and a strong diet. The dung collector's job was to make sure the streets didn't turn into a squishy obstacle course by mid-morning. They worked fast, because once the sun rose, the city came alive, and no one wanted to be ankle deep in yesterday's digestive regrets. They moved with the precision of a ballet dancer and the resignation of someone who knew they'd never be invited to dinner at the priest's house. And the smell. Let's just say, if you ever wondered why ancient Egyptians wore so much perfume, now you know. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just about cleanliness. Dung was valuable. It was used as fertilizer, fuel, and even building material. So while the job stank, literally, it was essential. Without dung collectors, the city would have collapsed under the weight of its own contributions. And what did they collect? Human waste, donkey droppings, rotting scraps, all by hand. That was the daily harvest of the ancient Egyptian dung collector. No fancy tools, no carts. Just a woven basket, a strong back, and a job description that read like a punishment from the gods. These brave souls didn't just scoop poop. They curated it. They sorted through the streets for anything remotely organic human leftovers, animal leavings, spoiled food, and the occasional mystery blob that no one wanted to identify. If it stank, squished, or buzzed, into the basket it went. And this wasn't a quick morning chore. It was a full-time, sun-up to sundown affair. The streets of Thebes and Memphis didn't clean themselves, and the donkeys certainly weren't going to start using designated drop zones. The dung collector had to be fast, thorough, and immune to shame. Children pointed. Priests held their noses. Cats judged silently from rooftops. But someone had to do it, or the city would drown in its own digestive history. And remember, this wasn't just about keeping the streets clean. That steaming pile of refuse, it was valuable. Dung was dried and used as fuel. Rotting scraps could be composted. Even human waste had its uses in agriculture and tanning. So while the job was disgusting, it was also essential. The dung collector was part sanitation worker, part recycler, part unsung environmentalist, centuries before anyone coined the term. But for all their importance, these workers got no protection. No boots, no tools, no "I love clean streets" tunics. The dung collector was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a superhero. If superheroes wore tattered linen, smelled like a compost heap, and were routinely ignored by everyone they saved. These folks were the sanitation system before sanitation was a thing. Without them, the streets of Thebes would have turned into a squishy, disease-ridden obstacle course where every step was a gamble and every breeze a biohazard. But did they get thanks? Applause. A nice mural in a tomb somewhere? Nope. They got side eyes, pinched noses, and a wide berth in the marketplace. People would cross the street, just to avoid walking near them, even if it meant stepping in the very thing the dung collector was trying to remove. That's irony with a side of foot fungus. They weren't allowed in temples. They weren't invited to festivals. If they showed up at a party, someone would, accidentally, drop a jug of perfume and pretend it was a coincidence. Even the stray cats gave them judgmental looks. And yet, without them, the city would have collapsed under the weight of its own digestive enthusiasm. And let's talk about the tools of the trade. No carts, no shovels, just a basket, a stick, and a prayer. They scooped, scraped, and sloshed their way through the streets, dodging donkeys and trying not to gag. Rainy days, mud and mystery puddles, hot days. Let's just say the smell could peel paint off a pyramid. And yet, they kept going. Because someone had to. They were the unsung heroes of hygiene, the guardians of the gutter, the noble noses of Nile, side neighborhoods. And while society may have shunned them, the city owed them everything, from its cleanliness to its crop yields. Because all that waste, it didn't just disappear, it was dried, repurposed, and reused. Fuel, fertilizer, even building material. That's right. Your house might have been held together by yesterday's donkey droppings. Sleep tight. So what did these brave, nose-blind souls earn for their efforts? Pay spoiled bread or scraps of lentils. Because nothing says, "Thank you for handling our collective bowel movements," like a moldy crust, and a bean that's seen better days. Stench never leaves your hands, or your dreams. You could scrub with natron, soak in lotus oil, and chant to every hygiene god in the pantheon. But if you spent your days scooping up ancient Egypt's digestive leftovers, that smell was your new personality. It clung to your skin, your clothes, your soul. You'd walk past a bakery, and the bread would recoil. Even the sacred cats gave you a wide berth, and those things licked their own butts. And the dreams. Oh, they came. Night after night, you'd relive the squelch of your foot in something warm, the squish of your hand in something worse, and the moment you realized that wasn't a date pit. You'd wake up in a cold sweat, only to realize it wasn't sweat. It was just the Nile humidity mixed with the lingering scent of yesterday's donkey disaster. But still, you got up every morning because someone had to do it. Someone had to keep the streets clean, the fields fertilized, and the temples from becoming fly-infested nightmares. You were the invisible backbone of the city, the olfactory martyr, the reason people could walk to market without gagging. And while you were out there, ankle deep in society's least glamorous exports, someone else was tucked away in a shaded corner of the temple, doing a very different kind of dirty work. The scribe's servant, carry scrolls, grind suit, mix ink, trim quills. That was the glamorous life of the scribe's servant, a job that sounded intellectual until you realized it was 90% soot and 10% papyrus splinters under your fingernails. These poor souls were the backstage crew of ancient Egyptian bureaucracy, making sure the scribes could sit comfortably and look wise while writing down tax records, temple inventories, and the occasional love poem that definitely overshared. Their day began before sunrise, fetching scrolls from dusty shelves taller than their ambitions. Then came the ink making, grinding soot into a fine powder, mixing it with water and gum arabic until it reached the perfect consistency of slightly less runny mud. If the ink was too thick, the scribe would complain. If it was too thin, the scribe would complain louder. And if it stained the scribe's linen tunic, well, let's just say someone was spending the night with the temple cats. Next came trimming quills. Not the fun kind with feathers and flair. No, these were painstakingly carved reeds that had to be cut just right. Too blunt, and the writing looked like a toddler's doodle. Too sharp, and the papyrus tore like a cheap toga. The servant's job was to keep the tools perfect, the ink flowing, and the scribe's ego inflated. And heaven forbid you smudged a scroll. That wasn't just a mistake, it was a sacrilege. You'd be lucky to get away with a scolding. More likely, you'd be reassigned to something even worse, like dung collection. Or fan, waving duty for a sweaty noble with garlic breath. But here's the real kicker. Despite handling sacred texts, royal decrees, and divine hymns all day long, the scribe's servant was often forbidden to read, even if you know how. Be silent, be still, be invisible. That was the unspoken motto of the scribe's servant. You weren't there to be seen. You were there to exist adjacent to excellence. Quietly, efficiently, and preferably without breathing too loudly. If the scribe coughed, you handed him water. If he sneezed, you offered a linen square. If he sighed dramatically while composing a tax record, you nodded solemnly like it was the book of the dead itself. You moved like a shadow, hovered like a breeze, and prayed to every deity that the scrolls didn't unroll themselves mid-transit. You didn't speak unless spoken to. You didn't sit unless told. And you definitely didn't ask questions like, why does the scribe get a cushion and I get a rock? That was a fast track to being reassigned to dung duty. Again. And heaven help you if you showed signs of intelligence. If you so much as glanced at a scroll too long, someone would accuse you of trying to read it, and reading. That was for scribes. You were there to carry, not comprehend. To mix, not muse. To trim quills, not question hieroglyphs. You were the backstage crew of the ancient world's most bureaucratic theatre. And the show must go on. Even if your fingers were stained black, and your back was shaped like a question mark. And if something went wrong, if the oil lamp flickered too much smoke, or the ink dried mid-sentence, hit if the lamp smokes, starved if the ink dries. Because in ancient Egypt, even the quiet jobs came with loud consequences. That was the daily performance review for the scribe's servant. No bonuses, no promotions. Just the constant threat of being smacked with a reed stick because the oil lamp dared to flicker or the ink decided to dry mid-hymn. You weren't just expected to be efficient. You were expected to be infallible. And in a world where humidity, soot, and papyrus all conspired against you, that was a tall order for someone who hadn't eaten since yesterday's lentil scrap. If the lamp smoked, it meant soot on the scroll. If there was soot on the scroll, the scribe would look at you like you'd personally insulted Thoth, god of writing. And if the ink dried, oh, that was a tragedy of epic proportions. You'd be blamed for wasting sacred materials, delaying divine documentation, and possibly cursing the entire temple with your incompetence. The punishment, no dinner, or worse, being reassigned to fan duty for the high priest's armpits during festival season. And yet, you stayed, because even in the shadows of the scribes, there was something intoxicating about being that close to knowledge. You carried the scrolls. You touched the ink. You watched the words take shape. You knew the symbols, the rhythms, the patterns. You could almost read them. But almost wasn't enough. Close to knowledge, but never allowed to own it. That was the cruel irony of the scribe's servant. You spent your days elbow deep in scrolls, ink, and divine decrees, yet you weren't allowed to read a single word. You could recite the shape of every hieroglyph from memory, knew which scroll belonged to which god, and could probably predict the next line of a royal tax record, just by the sigh your scribe made. But if you so much as looked too long at the text, someone would accuse you of overstepping. Reading was power. Reading was privilege. Reading was for scribes, priests, and the occasional noble who wanted to impress dinner guests. You were the ink monkey, the scroll sherpa, the quill whisperer. You were close enough to smell the papyrus, but not close enough to understand it. It was like being chained outside a bakery, forever catching the scent, never tasting the bread. And yet, some servants did learn. Quietly, secretly, watching the strokes, mimicking the shapes in the dirt behind the temple. But if they were caught, best case scenario, reassignment to dung duty. Worst case, a public beating and a very stern lecture about knowing your place. Ancient Egypt had a strict caste system, and literacy was a locked door with a very loud guard dog. Still, the scribe's servant endured. Because even if you couldn't read the words, you could feel their weight. You knew you were handling something sacred, something eternal. And that was almost enough. Almost. Meanwhile, in another corner of the temple complex, someone else was preparing for a very different kind of artistry. One that involved less ink and more arsenic. The tomb painter's assistant grind toxic minerals ochre, malachite, lapis lazuli. Because nothing says career hazard like inhaling powdered gemstones before breakfast. That was the daily to-do list for the tomb painter's assistant. A job that combined the glamour of ancient art with the respiratory hazards of a medieval chimney sweep. These assistants were the unsung heroes of Egypt's most colourful masterpieces, turning chunks of rock into vibrant pigments that would outlive empires. But before those colours could dazzle the gods, someone had to pulverize them into powder, using a stone mortar, a lot of elbow grace, and zero protective gear. Ochre was the easy one, just iron-rich clay that turned into earthy reds and yellows. Malachite, a lovely green copper carbonate that, when ground, released a fine dust that could turn your lungs into a cautionary tale. And lapis lazuli. Oh, the prized ultramarine blue, imported all the way from Afghanistan. Beautiful, yes. But once you started grinding it, you weren't just inhaling powdered royalty. You were also breathing in pyrite and silica, which could gift you with silicosis, dermatitis, or a cough that sounded like a haunted oboe. And yet, the job was considered lucky. You were part of the sacred process. You were helping decorate the tombs of nobles and pharaohs, ensuring their journey to the afterlife was painted in the finest hues. You just had to ignore the fact that your own afterlife might arrive a little early, courtesy of lapis dust. You worked in dimly lit workshops, hunched over stone slabs, grinding and mixing until your hands were stained and your nose was permanently offended. You weren't allowed to sneeze near the pigments. You weren't allowed to spill. And Ra help you if you accidentally used the blue, meant for Osiris, on a servant's sandal. And after all that effort, mix paints for scenes you'll never be allowed to touch. Because in ancient Egypt, even the paint had a hierarchy. That was the daily heartbreak of the tomb painter's assistant. You'd spend hours grinding precious minerals into pigment. Blue from lapis lazuli, green from malachite, red from ochre. Each one rarer than a day off. You'd mix them with egg whites, gum arabic, or whatever sticky substance the master painter demanded that day. All while being told, don't spill a drop, or you'll be scrubbing the floor with your eyebrows. And the worst part, you never got to use the paint. You weren't allowed to hold the brush, let alone touch the sacred walls. That was for the master painters, those elite few who got to bring the afterlife to life with sweeping strokes and divine scenes. You were the color mule, the pigment peasant, the guy who got yelled at when the blue was too blue or the red wasn't red enough. You'd stand there, holding a palette like it was the Ark of the Covenant, while the painter dabbed and judged and occasionally muttered, "This green feels anxious." You'd nod solemnly, pretending you understood what emotionally unstable green looked like, while secretly wondering if you could sneak a brushstroke when no one was looking. You couldn't. There were always eyes. Always. And while the painter basked in praise for his depiction of Osiris riding a sunboat through the underworld, you were in the corner, coughing up lapis dust and wondering if your lungs had turned ultramarine, because the paints were beautiful, but the process. Fumes make your eyes water, your lungs burn, and no one ever painted that on a tomb wall. That was the unofficial welcome message for every tomb painter's assistant. You'd walk into the workshop, take one breath, and immediately question every life choice that led you to this moment. The air was thick with powdered minerals, egg yolk, and the unmistakable scent of, "I should have been a fisherman." You weren't just inhaling color, you were becoming it. By lunchtime, your nostrils were lined with ochre, your teeth had a faint blue tint from lapis dust, and your lungs sounded like they were trying to whistle in hieroglyphs. And the heat. Oh, the heat. These workshops were tucked into tomb corridors or sun-baked courtyards, where the only ventilation came from the occasional sigh of a disappointed master painter. You'd be hunched over a grinding stone, sweat dripping into your pigment bowl, while the lead artisan barked things like, "That red looks too cheerful! Make it more mournful." You'd nod, as if you had a palette of emotions tucked under your tunic. The worst part, the pigments were gorgeous, vibrant, shimmering, divine. You'd mix them with reverence, watching the colors swirl like magic. But you weren't allowed to use them. No brush for you, no wall to paint. You were the pigment mule, the color concierge, the guy who made the art possible, but wasn't allowed to leave a single fingerprint on it. And the irony. These paints were considered sacred. They were blessed, stored in special jars, and handled like holy relics. If you spilled even a drop, it was a catastrophe. If you breathed too hard near the gold leaf, someone would gasp, like you'd insulted Ra's haircut. The paints were treated like royalty. Paints are sacred. But you are not. You were just the guy coughing in the corner, glowing faintly blue, and wondering if early retirement was a thing in 1300 BCE. The pigments you mixed were blessed, stored in sealed jars, and handled like divine relics. You were the guy who sneezed near the malachite and got yelled at for offending the gods. The paints were treated like royalty. You were treated like a walking dust rag with legs. You could spend hours grinding lapis lazuli into the perfect ultramarine, only to be told your blue was too smug. You'd mix ochre until your arms went numb, and the master painter would sniff and say, "It lacks emotional depth. Emotional depth. It's dirt, Neberman. It's literally dirt. And don't even think about touching the wall." That was sacred space. You could carry the pigments, stir the binders, even test the consistency on a scrap of limestone. But if your brush so much as hovered near the tomb wall, someone would tackle you like you'd tried to steal the pharaoh's sandals. The master painters got the glory. You got the gout. You worked in silence, in heat, in clouds of toxic dust. You weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to, and even then, it was usually to hear, "Why is this green so melancholy?" You'd nod, apologize to the green, and go back to grinding while your lungs quietly filed for early retirement. and yet you stayed. Because there was something magical about watching those colors come to life on the tomb walls. Gods, kings, sacred beasts, all brought into being with the pigments you prepared. You couldn't sign your name. You couldn't leave a mark. But you knew. You knew your hands helped build eternity. You color the afterlife, while your own life fades. You spent your days grinding brilliance into being, turning stone into color, color into story, story into eternity. You mixed the hues that would guide a pharaoh's soul through the underworld, painting gods, demons, and celestial boats with pigments so vivid they still glow thousands of years later. But your own story, that one faded faster than a sun-bleached linen tunic. No one carved your name into a tomb wall. No one painted you ascending into the field of reeds. You were the hand behind the brush, the breath behind the beauty. And when your lungs finally gave out from years, inhaling powdered minerals and egg fumes, the most you got was a nod from the master painter and maybe, a slightly less sarcastic grunt. And yet, you kept going, because there was something sacred in the work, something eternal. You knew that long after your bones turned to dust, your colors would still dance across the walls of the dead. You were anonymous, but your art was immortal. And in a world where most people were forgotten before their second loaf of bread, that was something. But while you were busy coloring the afterlife, someone else was out in the sun, knee deep in something far less poetic. The canal digger, waist deep in Nile mud, swarmed by mosquitoes. Because not every monument was built above ground, and not every job came with shade. That was the glamorous morning greeting for the canal digger, the ancient Egyptian who didn't need a gym membership because his daily workout involved shoveling sludge in a mosquito-infested swamp while being yelled at by a supervisor with a stick and a superiority complex. These were the men who carved the arteries of Egypt, one muddy scoop at a time, ensuring the Nile's life, giving waters reached the fields, the cities, and occasionally the pharaoh's private duck pond. Their tools, a wooden shovel, a reed basket, and a prayer to not get bitten in the eyeball by a mosquito the size of a fig. Their uniform, a loincloth, a sunburn, and a layer of mud so thick it could be carbon dated. And their work environment. Imagine a sauna, but with more bugs, less dignity, and the constant risk of stepping on something squishy that may or may not be alive. They started before dawn, when the air was only mildly suffocating, and worked until the sun turned the mud into a bubbling stew of despair. The Nile, majestic and serene from a distance, up close was a chaotic soup of reeds, frogs, fish, and things that slithered. Every step was a gamble. Would it be solid ground? A hidden hole? A disgruntled crocodile? Who knew? That's part of the fun. And the mosquitoes? Oh, the mosquitoes. These weren't your average backyard nuisances. These were Nile-bred, papyrus-fed, vengeance-driven sky demons with wings. They didn't just bite. They judged. They hovered in clouds, humming ancient curses, and treated canal diggers like an all-you-can-eat buffet. You could swat one, and 5 more would show up to mourn their fallen comrade and avenge his death. The work itself. Digging, hauling, dumping, repeat. You'd scoop out mud, lift it into a basket, carry it up the embankment, dump it, and then do it again. And again. And again. Your spine would creak like a temple door, your arms would feel like overcooked reeds, and your feet would be permanently pruned. And if you dared to pause for a breath, the overseer would remind you that the pharaoh's cucumbers weren't going to irrigate themselves. Lunch break, if you were lucky, a handful of barley and a gulp of lukewarm beer that tasted like regret. Bathroom break. Pick a bush and hope the mosquitoes didn't follow. And if you got sick, well, there's always another peasant waiting to take your place. The Nile waits for no one. But despite the misery, The canal diggers were essential. Without them, Egypt's fields would dry up. The crops would fail, and the pharaoh's bath would be very disappointing. They were the unsung hydrologists of the ancient world, muddy, bitten, and perpetually exhausted, back-breaking labor in water teeming with disease. Because nothing says civilization like dysentery with a side of sunstroke. That was the daily reality for the canal digger, Egypt's unofficial mud enthusiast and full-time human shovel. These poor souls were the reason the Nile's waters reached the fields, the temples, and the pharaoh's personal lotus garden. But while the elite floated by on gilded barges sipping date wine, the canal diggers were down in the trenches, literally, waist deep in a stew of silt, sweat, and suspicious squelching noises. The job was simple in theory: dig channels to direct the Nile's floodwaters. In practice, it was a never-ending battle against collapsing banks, biting insects, and mud that clung to your legs like a needy ex. The sun beat down like it had a personal grudge, and the humidity made every breath feel like sipping soup through your nose. You'd be lucky to go 5 minutes without swallowing a mosquito or stepping on something that hissed. And the water. Oh, the water. It looked serene from a distance, but up close it was a microbial mosh pit. Parasites, bacteria, and mystery floaters swirled around your ankles like they were auditioning for a plague. You didn't just risk sunburn. You risked dysentery, bilharzia, and a rash that spelled hieroglyphs. Every scratch was a potential infection. Every gulp of water was a gamble. And yet, you kept digging. Because if the canals didn't flow, the crops didn't grow, and then everyone got cranky. Supervision was generous in volume, if not in kindness. Overseers barked orders from the shade, occasionally throwing motivational pebbles if you slowed down. Breaks were rare. Shade was a myth. And lunch? A handful of barley and a sip of beer that had been warming in the sun since breakfast. If you were lucky, it hadn't fermented into something that could strip paint. But the worst part, the endless repetition. Dig, scoop, lift, dump. Dig, scoop, lift, dump. Your spine would scream, your arms would tremble, and your feet would squish in ways that haunted your dreams. And just when you thought you were done, the Nile would flood again and undo a week's worth of work in one glorious, muddy tantrum. And what did you do then? Drag baskets of sludge up the banks all day. Because in ancient Egypt, irrigation didn't come with a pump. It came with a peasant and a prayer. That was the canal digger's cardio routine, except instead of a gym, it was a mosquito-infested swamp, and instead of a personal trainer, it was a man with a stick yelling, "Faster, or the Nile floods your paycheck." The process was simple: scoop mud, fill basket, hoist it onto your shoulder, trudge up a slippery embankment, while trying not to fall face first into yesterday's leach pile, dump it, and repeat, about 400 times, before lunch. The baskets weren't ergonomic. They were woven reeds, soaked through, sagging, and held together by hope, an ancient twine. Each one weighed as much as a small goat, and if you spilled even a handful of sludge on the way up, you'd get a lecture about westing the pharaoh's waterway, from a man who hadn't touched mud since the last dynasty. And the banks? Oh, they were a delightful mix of loose gravel, wet clay, and the occasional angry frog. Every step was a gamble. You'd slip, slide, and occasionally invent new curse words in Middle Egyptian. If you were lucky, you only twisted an ankle. If you were unlucky, you got to meet the canal snake. His name was probably Steve. He was not friendly. There were no breaks. No shade. No, "Hey, great job moving that literal ton of sludge today. Here's a date cake." Just more baskets. More mud. More yelling. And the occasional reminder that if you didn't finish your section, the irrigation schedule would be off, and the barley wouldn't grow, and the priests would be cranky. and somehow you would be blamed for the gods being in a bad mood. And footwear, don't be silly. Shoes were for scribes and nobles, and people who didn't spend their days ankle deep in ancient soup. You had your feet, your coluses, and the vague hope that whatever just squished between your toes wasn't alive. No shoes, no break, no name. Because in ancient Egypt, the Nile gave life and took your lumbar spine in return. If you die, your body is just one more obstacle to dig around. That's the brutal truth of canal digging in ancient Egypt. There were no funerals, no eulogies, no dramatic harp solos. If you collapsed face first into the mud, the overseer might poke you with a stick, sigh dramatically, and then order the guy behind you to dig around him. You became part of the landscape. Just another bump in the trench. A cautionary tale with toes. There were no monuments for canal diggers, no tombs, no inscriptions. Just a vague hope that your body wouldn't be mistaken for a particularly stubborn clump of clay. And if someone did notice you'd stopped moving, well, congratulations. You just became a natural dam. The Nile thanks you for your service. And yet, the work went on. Because the water had to flow. The crops had to grow. And the pharaoh's bathwater wasn't going to irrigate itself. So the diggers kept digging, dragging baskets of sludge, swatting mosquitoes, and occasionally stepping over their former co-workers, with the kind of casual indifference that only comes from extreme dehydration and a complete lack of labor laws. But while one group toiled in the mud, another worked in the cool, quiet chambers of the dead, where the job was no less gruesome, just more surgical. The embalmer's apprentice, carve out brains through the nose, because nothing says career ladder like a hook, a nostril, and a very bad day. That was the first line on the embalmer's apprentice job description. Right after. Must not be squeamish. And comfortable with long hours in the company of the recently deceased. This wasn't your average internship. You didn't fetch coffee. You fetched cranial goo. With a hook. Through a nostril. The process was called excerebration, which is a fancy word for turning someone's brain into soup and removing it, like you're unclogging a very sacred drain. The apprentice would take a long, thin metal tool, shaped like something between a knitting needle and a nightmare, and gently insert it up the nostril. Then came the stirring. Not too fast, not too slow. You wanted to liquefy the brain, not redecorate the inside of the skull. Once it was sufficiently mushy, you'd tilt the head and let gravity do the rest. If it dripped out cleanly, congratulations, you were halfway to a promotion. If it got stuck, well, time to get creative, and maybe apologize to the gods. This wasn't just gruesome, it was necessary. The Egyptians believed the body had to be preserved for the afterlife, but the brain, useless. They thought the heart did all the thinking. The brain was just filler. So out it went, like yesterday's leftovers. And if you cracked the skull or left a mark on the face, that was a one-way ticket to latrine duty. The dead had to look good for eternity, even if their insides were now stored in jars. And speaking of jars, after the brain came the rest. The apprentice would help remove the stomach, intestines, lungs and liver, each lovingly placed in its own canopic jar, with a lid shaped like a protective deity. The heart, that stayed in. It was the VIP pass to the afterlife. Lose it, and the soul might flunk the final judgment. No pressure. But before the wrappings, before the amulets, before the dramatic golden mask, there was one more step. One that involved bloated bodies, sacred rituals, and a smell that could haunt your dreams. Wash bloated corpses with sacred oils, because nothing says divine preparation like scrubbing a swollen noble with frankincense and a prayer. Stuff, bind, reason, seal until nothing human remains. That was the embalmer's apprentice's final act in the ancient Egyptian makeover montage. after the brain had been whisked out, like a particularly unpleasant smoothie, and the organs had been jarred and labelled like a divine charcuterie board. It was time to turn the dearly departed into a mummy-shaped monument to eternal preservation. First came the stuffing. Linen, sawdust, resin-soaked rags. Anything to keep the body from collapsing like a poorly made bread loaf. The goal was to maintain that regal, lifelike shape, even if the person inside had been dead longer than the bread in your pantry. Then came the binding. Layer after layer of linen strips, each one carefully wrapped, tucked, and occasionally glued down with resin that smelled like burnt tree sap and despair. And oh, the resin. It was everywhere, poured into the body cavity, slathered over the wrappings, used to glue amulets in place like spiritual duct tape. It sealed the body like a divine Tupperware container, airtight, watertight, and absolutely not breathable. The end result: a glossy, hardened shell that looked vaguely human and smelled vaguely like a campfire in a spice market. The apprentice's job was to assist in all of this, holding limbs in place, smoothing resin, and trying not to pass out from the fumes. You'd go home with your hands sticky, your tunic ruined, and your hair smelling like you'd been hugged by a pine tree that had a nervous breakdown. And no matter how much you scrubbed, no matter how many sacred oils you borrowed from the temple stash, stink never leaves your skin. Because when your job is preserving the dead tend to leave a little something behind. Told it's holy work. Feels like a curse. That was the embalmer's apprentice's daily contradiction. You were reminded constantly. By priests, by elders, by the guy who hadn't touched a corpse in years, but still wore the fanciest amulet, that your work was sacred, divine, a calling from the gods themselves. But after your third corpse of the morning, bloated from Nile humidity and leaking in places you didn't know could leak, it started to feel less like a calling and more like a cosmic prank. They said you were preparing souls for eternity, but it sure felt like you were preparing yourself for an early grave. You spent your days elbow deep in the dearly departed, scrubbing, stuffing, and sealing bodies like you were packaging leftovers for the afterlife. The sacred oils burned your skin. The natron dried your hands until they cracked like old papyrus. And the smell. Oh, the smell. It clung to you like a curse. Sweet, sour, and unmistakably eternal. You weren't allowed to complain. Not out loud. Not unless you wanted to be reassigned to the experimental resin team, which was a fancy way of saying, "We're not sure if this will explode." You just nodded solemnly, muttered a prayer to Anubis, and kept working, because someone had to make sure the pharaoh didn't arrive in the afterlife looking like a deflated wineskin. And yet, despite the rituals, the chants, the incense, and the constant reminders that this was holy work, you couldn't shake the feeling that you were more janitor than priest. You knew the human body better than most physicians. You could identify a liver by smell alone. You could wrap a corpse tighter than a merchant's coin purse. But no one looked at you with reverence. They looked at you like you might still have corpse juice on your sandals. You were surrounded by death. You understood it. You respected it. You made it beautiful. But in life, you know death intimately, but no one will sit near you. Because even in a land obsessed with the afterlife, no one wants to share a bench with the guy who smells like embalming resin and existential dread. You've spent your days elbow, deep in the dearly departed, whispering prayers over bloated bodies and stuffing linen into places linen was never meant to go. You've helped preserve the pharaoh's favorite cousin, his least favorite advisor, and at least one guy who definitely died from eating something he shouldn't have. You've seen it all. Decay, dignity, and the occasional posthumous surprise. You've scrubbed, sliced, stuffed, and sealed. You've watched the soul leave and the flies arrive. And yet, when you walk into the market for a loaf of barley bread, people part like the Red Sea. Children hide behind their mothers. Cats hiss. Even the fishmonger, who smells like regret and river slime, wrinkles his nose at you. You could be the cleanest person in the city. Fresh tunic, sacred oils, a sprig of lotus behind your ear. And still, the scent of your profession clings to you like a ghost with boundary issues. You try to make conversation. Lovely weather for embalming. Silence. You sit on a bench. The person next to you suddenly remembers they left their goat boiling. You reach for a fig, and the vendor says, "That one's reserved." You're not cursed. You're just gross. Holy, yes. Essential, absolutely. But also, ooh. And so you keep your distance. You walk the long way home. You eat alone. You sleep with the windows open, hoping the breeze will carry away the scent of resin and mortality. You know more about the human body than most physicians. You've seen the heart weighed against a feather. But in life, you're just the guy who smells like the afterlife. Still, someone has to do it. Someone has to prepare the dead for eternity, even if it means being avoided in the here and now. Meanwhile, in the palace courtyards and noble estates, another kind of servant kneels. Not before the gods, but before the feet of the living. A foot washer kneel before nobles all day with a copper basin, because nothing says humble service like scrubbing someone else's sandals while they complain about the temperature of their grapes. That was the daily routine of the foot washer, a job so humbling, even dung collectors looked down on it, from a safe, smelly distance. You weren't just a servant, you were a floor-level servant. Your entire career took place at ankle height, face to foot with the most pampered toes in the kingdom. And not just any toes, noble toes. The kind that hadn't seen a day of labor in their lives, but had somehow managed to collect every grain of sand from Memphis to Thebes. Your tools, a copper basin, a rag, and a smile that said, "Yes, my lord. I do enjoy exfoliating your coluses." You'd kneel on hard stone floors, your knees slowly turning into archaeological artifacts, while the noble sat on a cushioned stool, sipping date wine and pretending not to notice. You were scrubbing something that looked suspiciously like a fungal rebellion. And the smells. Let's just say that after a long day in the Egyptian sun, noble feet were less lotus blossom and more fermented sandal stew. You try not to gag as you dipped your rag, swirled the water, and prayed to every god in the pantheon that this noble didn't have a second foot. But it wasn't just about the washing. Oh no. You were expected to be invisible, silent, and grateful. If the water was too cold, your fault. Too warm, still your fault. If the noble stubbed his toe last week and it still hurt, somehow, definitely your fault. You were the scapegoat of the lower limbs. And the conversation, non-existent. Unless you count being barked at like a disobedient goat. You weren't there to talk. You were there to serve. To kneel. To nod. To absorb every insult like a Lennon sponge soaked in sarcasm. You were the human welcome mat of the elite, stepped on, ignored, and occasionally tripped over. Scrub their feet. Obey every order. Accept every insult. Because in ancient Egypt, even the lowest job had room to fall. One wrong move, and you're struck or mocked. That's the daily tightrope walk of the foot washer. Except the tightrope is made of cracked limestone, and the audience is a noble with a superiority complex and a suspicious bunyan. You kneel there, copper basin in hand, trying to scrub someone's royal toe jam without accidentally tickling them, which is apparently treasonous, or making the water too splashy, which is also treasonous. You're not just washing feet, you're navigating a minefield of noble sensitivities. If you scrub too hard. Oh! Do you think I'm a donkey? Too soft? Are you even trying? Or are you just petting my foot? If you look up, eyes down, peasant. If you look down, are you ignoring me? If you breathe too loud, do you mind? I'm trying to meditate on my greatness. And heaven forbid you sneeze. That's not just a bodily function. It's an insult. You'll be accused of trying to hex their sandals. You'll be reassigned to latrine incense duty, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're expected to anticipate their every whim. Warm water in winter, cool water in summer, and a towel that's somehow both soft and embroidered with their family crest. You must nod at every complaint, agree with every ridiculous story. Yes, my lord, I too believe your feet are blessed by the gods, and pretend not to notice the fungal situation developing between their toes like a small civilization. And the worst part, you're not even a person to them. You're a foot-washing accessory, a background character in their sandal-centric drama. You could vanish mid-scrub, and they'd just assume the basin had developed legs and wandered off. You are lower than their sandals, and their sandals have names. Yes, names, not metaphorical ones either. Actual spoken with pride names. These are my ceremonial Hotep sandals, hand-stitched by blind monks in the Valley of the Artisans. Or, these are my Elijah sandals, Nebit and Khufu. Khufu's the left one. He's a bit tight, but loyal. Meanwhile, you, the foot washer, are just, hey, you. Or worse, not you again. The sandals get polished. You get ignored. The sandals get stored in cedar boxes lined with linen. You get stored in the back of the servant quarters, next to a guy who talks to onions. The sandals are paraded through temples, festivals, and royal banquets. You're lucky if you get to see the sun between scrubbing sessions. And the nobles, they love it. They adore the hierarchy. It's not enough for them to be above you. They need to feel it. Every toe you scrub, every insult you swallow, every time you flinch when they accidentally kick the basin over and blame you for splashing their sacred ankle. It all reinforces the divine order of things. You're not just beneath them. You're beneath their footwear. And their footwear has opinions. You kneel. You nod. You whisper apologies to a sandal named Blessed by Rye. And the nobles smile, sip their wine, and talk about how the lower classes just don't appreciate the dignity of service. And that's exactly how they want you. Quiet, kneeling, and one toe away from total invisibility. You're not a servant. You're a furnishing, a decorative humility piece, a background character in the grand drama of noble life, whose only line is, yes, my lord, and whose only prop is a damp rag and a basin that smells faintly of feet and crushed dreams. You kneel so long your knees develop their own personalities. You scrub so hard your fingers forget what dry feels like, and you smile, because frowning might be interpreted as rebellion, and rebellion gets you reassigned to latrine sponge rotation. You're not just beneath them socially. You're beneath them physically. You live at shin level. You know every collis, every corn, every toe ring engraved with property of rye. You've seen things no one should see, and yet you're expected to be grateful. Because, as the overseer says, at least you're not feeding the crocodiles. Ah yes, the crocodiles. Because while you're busy massaging sandal blisters and pretending not to hear nobles argue about whose sandals are more spiritually aligned, someone else is performing a very different kind of sacred service. The crocodile feeder, Temple of Sobek, houses sacred crocodiles, because in ancient Egypt, even the reptiles had a better retirement plan than you. Yes, sacred, as in divine, revered, and possibly plotting your demise. These weren't your average swamp-dwelling reptiles. These were the VIPs of the Nile, lounging in temple pools like scaly gods on vacation. Worshippers came from miles around to offer prayers, toss in offerings, and nervously pretend they weren't terrified of the 15 foot embodiment of divine judgment blinking at them from the water. The crocodiles were believed to be living avatars of Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of strength, fertility, and don't swim here. And so, naturally, someone had to feed them. Enter the crocodile feeder, part zookeeper, part priest, part adrenaline junkie with questionable life choices. This wasn't a job for the faint of heart, or the slow of reflex. These beasts weren't nibbling on grapes and humming hymns. They were prehistoric tanks with teeth, and they knew exactly who brought the snacks. The temple kept them well fed, but not too well fed, just enough to keep them holy, but still interested in lunging at anything that smelled like lunch. And who brought that lunch? You bring raw meat, inching close to the beast. Because nothing says spiritual devotion like dangling a goat leg in front of a divine death lizard. At the temple of Sobek, the crocodiles weren't just reptiles, they were holy reptiles, living gods with teeth. And you, the crocodile feeder, were their humble, trembling waiter. You didn't just toss meat from a safe distance. Oh no. That would be disrespectful. You had to approach, slowly, reverently, like you were offering hors d'oeuvres to a very large, very scaly pharaoh with a short temper and no concept of personal space. The sacred pool was calm, until it wasn't. One moment, the water shimmered like polished obsidian. The next, it erupted in a blur of jaws and tail. You'd inch forward, clutching a dripping hunk of goat, whispering prayers to Sobek, to Anubis, to anyone who might be listening. The crocodile would rise from the depths like a scaly submarine, eyes locked on you like you owed it money. And you had to look calm. That was part of the ritual. No flinching, no screaming. No. Oh, gods. It's coming right at me! You were supposed to radiate serenity while holding a bleeding leg in front of a creature that could turn you into a snack wrap in under 3 seconds. The priests watched. The worshippers watched. The crocodile watched. And you tried not to cry. Sometimes, the beast would take the offering gently. A graceful snap, a satisfied grunt, a slow return to the depths. Other times, it lunged, fast, loud, with a splash that soaked your tunic and a snap that echoed off the temple walls. And if you weren't quick, if your foot slipped, if your hand trembled, if you misread the twitch of its tail, one slip, one missed signal, and you're a sacrifice. Not the ceremonial kind, the crunchy kind. Because the crocodile doesn't care that you're wearing temple linen. It doesn't care that you whispered a prayer to Sobek, or that you bowed respectfully before tossing in the goat leg. It sees movement, it sees meat, it sees you. And suddenly you're not the feeder, you're the entree. There's no warning, no dramatic music. Just a blur of muscle and teeth, a splash that soaks your sandals, and a moment of pure, unfiltered panic as you realize the sacred beast has decided to test your reflexes. You drop the meat. You stumble back. You flail like a startled ibis. And if you're lucky, the crocodile takes the offering and not your arm. If you're unlucky, well, let's just say the next offering might include a little extra protein. And the priests, they'll call it divine will. A holy sign Sobek has chosen. They'll say, while quietly updating the temple roster and assigning your sandals to the next apprentice. No one sues the crocodile. No one questions the crocodile. The crocodile is blessed. You are replaceable. There are no safety rails, no protective spells, no beware of God reptile signs. Just you, slippery stone ledge, and a creature that's been perfecting the art of ambush since before pyramids were a thing. You can't run. You can't hide. You can only hope that today, Sobek is in a good mood and not craving something with a bit more crunch. No fences. No rope. Just fear and fangs. Because in the temple of the crocodile god, Ose stands for Sobek. He's appetizer. There's no safety briefing. No waiver to sign. No, in case of emergency, scream here, protocol. Just you, a slab of raw meat, and a crocodile that's been worshipped longer than most dynasties lasted. The priests say it's safe. They say the crocodile is calm. They say Sobek protects his feeders. But Sobek also has teeth. Lots of them. And a jaw that can snap a papyrus boat in half like a breadstick. You inch forward, barefoot on slick temple stone, clutching a goat haunch that's dripping onto your only tunic. The crocodile watches. Always watches. It doesn't blink. It doesn't breathe. It just waits. You whisper a prayer. You offer the meat. You try not to look like a snack with legs. And the priests, they're watching too. Not to help. Oh no. They're watching to see if Sobek accepts your offering. If he lunges, it's a sign. If he doesn't, it's also a sign. Everything's a sign. Except when it's just a crocodile being a crocodile and deciding you look tastier than the goat. You've seen it happen. The apprentice who tripped. The priest who got too confident. The tourist who thought sacred meant tame. One moment they're there, the next. Splash, snap, silence. The temple doesn't pause. The chants don't stop. The crocodile gets a bonus meal, and the rest of you get a reminder Sobek giveth, and Sobek devoureth. And yet they call it a privilege, a sacred duty, a divine appointment. It's called an honor. You don't believe them. But you keep feeding the beast. Because saying no might be even more dangerous than saying yes. You nod when the priest says, Sobek smiles upon you. You smile when the tourists toss coins into the sacred pool and whisper, how brave? You even bow when the crocodile blinks in your direction, as if to say, you again. Because the alternative is worse. Refuse the job, and suddenly you're not just unemployed, you're unblessed. And in ancient Egypt, being unblessed was a fast track to being unburied. So you keep showing up, keep offering meat, keep pretending that the crocodile's yawn isn't a threat. You learn to read the twitch of its tail, the ripple in the water, the subtle difference between I'm full and I'm just stretching before dessert. You become fluent in reptilian body language and fluent in fear. And still, they call it an honor. But you know better. You've seen the bones at the bottom of the pool. You've seen the sandals left behind. You've seen the way the priests look away when the water turns red. And so, when the temple bell rings and they say, it's time, you take the meat, steady your hands, and walk toward the pool. Because saying no isn't just dangerous, it's unthinkable. Meanwhile, across the desert, under a sun that feels personally offended by your existence, another kind of laborer grips a rope with blistered hands and a prayer for shade. The pyramid rope puller grasps a thick rope, haul multi-ton stones across sand, because when the gods want monuments, someone has to sweat for eternity. You are the muscle behind the miracle, the anonymous engine that drags the divine into existence. The pharaoh points at the horizon and says, build me a mountain. And you, sunburned, dehydrated, and one bad sneeze away from a hernia, say, yes, my lord, and grab the rope. The rope is thick, coarse, frayed in places. It smells like sweat, dust, and the crushed dreams of the last guy who pulled it. You wrap it around your hands, plant your feet in the sand, and wait for the overseer's signal. Then, pull, with your back, with your legs, with your soul. The stone doesn't move. You pull harder. It moves an inch. The overseer yells, faster? As if momentum is a thing you can summon with optimism. You're not alone. There are dozens of you, all grunting in unison like a choir of exhausted oxen. You lean, you heave, you curse the sun, and you pray the sled doesn't hit a rock and jolt your spine into a new shape. The sand offers no mercy. It shifts beneath your feet, swallowing your sandals and your dignity. You sweat so much your sweat sweats. Your tunic fuses to your back. Your shadow gives up and walks away. And the stone, it just sits there, smug, immovable, a monument to your suffering. You drag it inch by inch, hour by hour, while priests chant blessings and architects argue about angles from the shade. You are the reason the pyramid rises, but no one will carve your name into the limestone. You'll be lucky if they let you keep your teeth. And the rope? Oh, the rope. It's your lifeline and your tormentor. It digs into your palms, slices your fingers, and leaves behind coluses shaped like regret. You can't let go. Not unless you want to be trampled by the sled, or yelled at by a man whose only job is pointing at things and sweating less than you. If you fall, the rope burns through your flesh, because in the kingdom of the gods, even gravity has a temper. There's no mercy in the sand, no pause button. No, oops, I slipped. Clause in the pyramid construction manual. You lose your grip, and the rope doesn't care. It keeps moving. It hisses through your hands like a serpent dipped in fire, peeling away skin with every inch. You scream. The overseer yells louder. The stone doesn't stop. It just keeps sliding forward, majestic and indifferent, like it's late for a divine appointment. You try to recover, but the rope's already branded your palms with the sacred sigil of should have worn gloves. Not that gloves exist. Your fellow pullers glance at you, not with sympathy, but with that look that says, better you than me. Because if you slow down, if you fall behind, if you become dead weight, well, there's no room for dead weight on a pyramid crew. The sled groans. The sand shifts. The sun laughs. You dig your heels in and pull like your afterlife depends on it. Because it might. The priests say this is holy work, that every stone you move brings the pharaoh closer to eternity. But your eternity feels a lot more like blisters, dehydration, and the constant threat of being crushed by a monument to someone else's ego. And if you collapse, if your knees buckle, your vision blurs, and you drop like a sack of barley. If someone collapses, the block keeps moving, because the gods demand pyramids, not pity. There's no pause for breath, no moment of silence. No, let's check on poor Hapu, who just face-planted into the sand. The sled keeps sliding. The rope keeps pulling. The overseer keeps yelling. And Hapu becomes part of the scenery. Maybe someone drags him to the side. Maybe someone steps over him. Maybe someone mutters, "I always had weak ankles." And then it's back to hauling limestone like your afterlife depends on it. Because it does. You're not building a tomb. You're building a ladder to eternity. Every block is a rung. Every stone a prayer. Every drop of sweat a down payment on divine favor. And if you die in the process, well, that's just proof of your devotion. A pharaoh gets a monument. You get a blister and a vague hope that someone will remember your name long enough to not reuse your loincloth. You don't get to admire the architecture. You don't get to marvel at the angles or the way the sun hits the capstone, just right on the solstice. You don't get to stand back and say, "I helped build that." Because by the time the last stone is set, you're either dead, reassigned, or too hunched over to look up. You never see the tomb's final form. You just drag the pieces into place and vanish like the sand beneath them. You're not the architect. You're not the overseer. You're not even the guy who gets to chisel a decorative lotus on the corner block. You're the one who hauls, who sweats, who bleeds. You're the one who gets yelled at when the sled veers off course, or the rope frays, or the sun dares to rise, before you've had a sip of barley beer. You don't get to marvel at the finished pyramid. You don't get to stand back and say, "I helped build that." Because by the time the capstone is placed, you're long gone, either reassigned, retired, or reduced to a cautionary tale about hydrating properly. The nobles will walk through the finished tomb in awe, admiring the carvings, the gold, the symmetry. They'll never think about the men who dragged the stones, who slipped in the sand, who left pieces of themselves in every groove and crevice. But the pyramid remembers. It remembers the calloused hands, the sunburned backs, the curses muttered under breath. It remembers the crushed fingers, the twisted ankles, the quiet groans of men who kept pulling even when their bodies begged them to stop. It remembers the ones who didn't make it to the end of the rope. Because, while your name isn't carved into the wall, your sweat is in the mortar. Your blood is in the sand beneath the foundation. Your breath is trapped in the cracks between the stones. But your broken body is inside its walls forever, not as a king, not as a god, but as the price of their immortality. You are the mortar between the myths, the sinew beneath the stone. The reason the pharaoh's name echoes through eternity while yours was forgotten before the sweat dried on your brow. You didn't get a tomb. You built one. You didn't get a golden mask. You got a sunburn that peeled in hieroglyphs. You didn't get a book of the dead. You got a backhatch and a vague sense that your spine had filed for divorce. And yet, there you are, entombed in the very walls you helped raise. Maybe not your whole body. Maybe just a finger. A tooth. A smear of blood on a block that no one noticed, because the overseer was too busy yelling about symmetry. But it's there. You're there. Trapped in limestone and legacy. A silent offering to the gods of architecture and ambition. They'll say the pyramid was built by divine will, by celestial alignment, by the genius of royal architects. But you know better. It was built by calloused hands, blistered feet, and the kind of stubbornness that only comes from knowing you'll never be remembered, but building anyway. And while the nobles are buried with treasures and spells, you're buried in the walls. No ceremony, no procession. Just a quiet collapse. A quick cover-up, and a new guy handed your rope. But before the stone ever reached the desert floor, before the sleds groaned and the ropes snapped, someone had to carve it free. Someone had to face the cliffside and say, "Yes, I'd love to spend the next 12 hours hitting a rock with a smaller rock." The quarryman, alone in the desert, chipping rock for hours. Because every monument starts with a man, a chisel, and a complete lack of better options. You wake before the sun. Not because you're eager, but because the sun doesn't wait. It rises like a flaming overseer, glaring down on your patch of cliffside, like it's personally offended by your existence. You trudge out to the quarry, past the bones of yesterday's lunch and the echoes of yesterday's curses, and you find your stone. Not a metaphorical one. A literal, massive, uncooperative slab of limestone that looks at you like, "Go ahead. Try me." There's no team. No rope pulling chorus. No priest chanting blessings over your shoulder. Just you, the wind, and the occasional vulture doing a slow circle above, as if it's penciled you into its lunch schedule. You don't get shade. You don't get water breaks. You get dust. In your eyes, your mouth, your soul. You cough and it comes out in sediment. The work, it's not glamorous. It's not even interesting. You chip. You chip again. You chip until your hands go numb, and your ears ring with the sound of stone laughing at your effort. You're not sculpting. You're liberating blocks from the cliffside, one flake at a time, like a dentist with anger issues. Every now and then, a chunk falls off, and you feel a flicker of pride, until you realize it's the wrong chunk, and now the whole slab is useless. Congratulations, you've just made a very heavy paperweight. And the tools? Oh, the tools. No bronze saws. No fancy levers. Just a hammer that's seen better dynasties. And a chisel that's more suggestion than blade. You sharpen it on a rock. You sharpen the rock on your will to live. You mutter to yourself. You name the stone. You threaten it. You beg it. You promise to visit your mother more, if it'll just split cleanly this time. No one visits. No one checks in. The overseer might wander by once a week to grunt and say, "That one's too round," before disappearing into the mirage. You could die out here, and the only witness would be a lizard with commitment issues. But still, you chip. Because someone has to. Because the pyramid won't build itself. Because the gods demand monuments, and monuments demand misery. Hammer and chisel, that's all. And a stubborn streak wide enough to split granite. No pulleys, no levers, no divine intervention. Just you, a sun-scorched cliff face, and two tools that haven't evolved since the gods were toddlers. You don't get blueprints. You get a pointed finger and a grunt. That one. And so you begin tapping, chipping, coaxing the stone like it owes you money. You learn the rhythm. Tap, tap, kratske, tap, tap, curse. You whisper threats to the rock. You name it. You insult its lineage. You promise to marry its cousin if it'll just split cleanly. The stone doesn't care. It's been here for 1,000,000 years and plans to outlast your grandchildren. But you've got a deadline and a foreman with a stick. The sun bakes your back. The wind throws sand in your face like a petty sibling. Your hands blister, your arms ache, and your legs forget what standing straight feels like. You drink water that tastes like warm regret, and chew bread that could double as a building material. And still, you chip. Because if you don't, someone else will. And they'll get your spot, and your bread, and maybe your sandals. You dream in stone. You wake up with grit in your teeth. You start to believe the rock is whispering back. You laugh. Then you cough. Then you keep working. Dust fills your eyes, mouth, lungs. Because in the quarry, even the air is trying to bury you. It coats your tongue like powdered limestone misery. You blink, and it grinds against your eyeballs like sandpaper dipped in regret. You cough, and it comes out in puffs. Tiny clouds of pulverized cliffside that used to be part of something majestic and now just wants to live rent, free in your respiratory system. You try wrapping a cloth around your face. It helps for about 5 minutes, until it becomes a damp, dusty sponge that smells like old sweat and crushed ambition. You spit. It's gritty. You sneeze. It's architectural. You breathe, and it feels like inhaling the ghost of every rock you've ever chipped. The dust gets everywhere. In your ears. In your hair. In places you didn't know had pores. You go home and shake out your tunic, and a small dune forms on the floor. You scratch your scalp and wonder if you've just unearthed a new layer of sediment. You blow your nose and discover a geological timeline. And the worst part, no one cares. The overseer doesn't care. The priest doesn't care. The rock definitely doesn't care. You could be coughing up a miniature sphinx, and the only response you'd get is, back to work. You chip. You wheeze. You blink through the haze. And still, the stone looms in front of you, unmoved, unbothered, and deeply unimpressed. The sun never moves. The stone never softens. Because in the quarry, time is a circle and your suffering is its favorite shape. Morning, noon, and whatever comes after, it's all the same. The sun hangs in the sky like a judgmental overseer, glaring down with the intensity of 1,000 unpaid debts. It doesn't rise. It doesn't set. It just hovers, daring you to blink. And the stone, it mocks you. It doesn't crack. It doesn't yield. It just exists, smug and immovable, like it knows you'll break long before it does. You chip, and the rock shrugs. You sweat, and the sand drinks it like wine. You scream, and the wind carries it off like gossip. The hours blur. The days melt. The only thing that changes is the depth of your blisters and the creativity of your curses. You start to forget what shade feels like, what silence sounds like, what your own name even was before it got replaced with you faster. You become part of the quarry. A moving shadow. A coughing echo. A pair of hands with just enough willpower to keep swinging. And when the day finally ends, if it ends, you don't go home. There is no home. There's just a patch of stone that's slightly less jagged than the rest. You curl up on it, muscles twitching, skin raw, lungs full of powdered cliffside, and you close your eyes. You sleep on the same rock you bleed into. Because in the quarry, comfort is a myth and the stone is always waiting. There's no bedroll, no blanket. Just the same slab of stone that's been slowly stealing your spine's will to live since sunrise. You curl up in the shallow groove your body has worn into the rock over weeks of repetition, like a fossil in progress. The dust clings to your skin, your tunic, your dreams. You cough, and it echoes off the cliff face like the quarry itself is mocking you. You don't dream of escape. You dream of shade, of water that doesn't taste like regret, of a day when your hands don't ache before you even open your eyes. But mostly, you dream of silence, of a world without the endless tap. Tap, tap of hammer on stone, the rhythm of your own erosion. And when the sun rises again, because it always does, smug and punctual, you rise with it. Not because you're rested, not because you're ready, but because the stone is already waiting, and the overseer's shadow is already stretching toward you. You wipe the blood from your palms, pick up your tools, and begin again. Meanwhile, far from the cliffs and dust, another laborer steps into a different kind of misery, one that squelches between the toes and hums with insects. The reed cutter, wade into swampy banks to cut papyrus and reeds. Because even the gods need scrolls, and someone has to fetch the paper. You don't get a chisel, you don't get a rope, you get a sickle, a sack, and a swamp that smells like something died, came back to life, and died again out of spite. Your job: harvest the sacred papyrus, divine plant of scribes, tax collectors, and people who think writing is more important than not being ankle deep in leech soup. You wade in at dawn, when the mist still clings to the water like a bad omen. The reeds tower over you, whispering secrets in the wind, or maybe just laughing. You swing your blade low, slicing stalks with practiced rhythm, trying not to think about what just brushed past your leg. Was it a fish, a frog, a snake, a god? You don't ask, you just keep cutting. The sun rises, the bugs wake up, the air turns into a buzzing, biting cloud of misery. You slap, you itch, you curse the Nile and every deity who ever said, papyrus is sacred. You fill your sack with reeds, your boots with mud, and your soul with regret. And the reeds, they fight back. Their stems are sharp, their edges serrated like nature's paper cuts. You come home with hands that look like you lost a knife fight with a salad. And the water, oh the water, it's not just wet, it's alive, teeming with things that want to crawl into your skin, lay eggs, and start a family. Sharp stems slice skin, water carries parasites. Because in the land of scrolls and scribes, someone has to bleed for the bibliography. You don't just harvest papyrus, you survive it. The reeds may look delicate from a distance, swaying gently in the Nile breeze like nature's bookmarks, but up close, they're serrated sabers with a vendetta. Every swing of your sickle is a gamble. Will it slice cleanly? Or will it whip back and tattoo your forearm with another papyrus kiss? And the water, it's not water. It's a living soup of things that squirm, sting, and occasionally hatch. You wade in ankle deep, then knee deep, then waist deep. And by the time you realize something's nibbling your shin, it's already filed a change of address form for your bloodstream. You scratch. You itch. You wonder if that bump is a mosquito bite or the beginning of a new ecosystem. You try not to think about the worms. The ones that burrow. The ones that wait. The ones that emerge weeks later like, surprise! I live here now. You try not to think about the priest who said, papyrus is sacred, while standing on dry land with sandals that had never known swamp mud. And just when you think it can't get worse, when your sack is full, your skin is shredded, and your legs feel like they've been marinated in mosquito venom, you feel it. A shift in the reeds, a ripple in the water, a presence. Snakes coil near your ankles, because even the scribe's paper trail has fangs. You came for papyrus. You found a hiss. The reeds part just enough to reveal a glint of scales, a flickering tongue, and the unmistakable stillness of something that's thinking about you. The snake doesn't move. It doesn't need to. It's already coiled, tight, patient, and perfectly positioned to remind you that literacy has a body count. You freeze. You breathe through your teeth. You try to remember if this is the kind that bites, or the kind that really bites. Either way, you're not about to test its reading comprehension. You inch back, slowly, respectfully, like you're backing away from a very judgmental librarian. And just when you think you've avoided disaster, when the reed's close behind you and your heart starts to unclench, you hear it. A ripple, a shift, a silence that feels intentional. You turn your head, and there it is. Crocodiles drift silently too close. Because in the Nile's library, overdue fees are enforced with teeth. They don't splash. They don't growl. They don't even blink. They just exist, half submerged, half statue, all menace. You never hear them coming. You only feel it, a shift in the water, a ripple that wasn't yours, a sudden stillness in the reeds that makes your spine whisper, run. But you don't. Because you can't. Because you're waist deep in swamp water, holding a bundle of papyrus, like it's going to protect you from a prehistoric apex predator, with a jaw that could snap a chariot in half. You freeze. You breathe through your nose. You try to remember the priest's advice. If you see a crocodile, remain calm. Easy for him to say. He's never had one eyeball his kneecaps like they're appetizers. You glance down. The water is murky, brown-green, thick with silt and secrets. You can't see the bottom. You can't see your feet. You can see a pair of nostrils and 2 yellow eyes floating 10 paces away, watching you like a librarian who's just noticed you dog-eared a scroll. You shift your weight. Slowly, carefully, the reeds rustle. The crocodile doesn't move. It doesn't need to. It's already in position. You know how they hunt. Everyone knows. They wait. They drift. They let you forget they're there. And then, when you're distracted, when you're reaching for that last stalk, when your sack is full, when you think you've made it, they strike. Fast. Final. Fatal. You've heard the stories. The reed cutter who vanished without a sound. The apprentice who thought he saw a log. The priest who insisted the sacred crocodiles wouldn't harm the faithful. Right before one of them decided to test his theology. You've seen the scars on the older cutters. The missing fingers. The limp. The way they flinch at the sound of splashing water. You don't want to be a story. So you stay still. You wait. You let the crocodile drift past, slow and deliberate, like it's giving you a chance to reconsider your life choices. It doesn't lunge. Not today. Maybe it's full. Maybe it's bored. Maybe it's just letting you stew in your own fear for a while longer. Whatever the reason, it glides by, tail swaying like a lazy whip, and disappears into the reeds with a whisper of water and a promise next time. You exhale, quietly, carefully. You don't celebrate. You don't move fast. You just keep cutting. One stalk at a time, one breath at a time. The sun climbs higher. The bugs grow louder. The water gets warmer, thicker, more alive. You itch. You bleed. You curse the gods, then apologize, just in case they're listening. You think about the scribes, those pampered, perfumed men in linen robes who sit in shaded courtyards, dipping their brushes into ink and writing poems about lotus blossoms and eternal love. They don't know where papyrus comes from. They don't know what it costs. They don't know that every scroll they unroll was paid for in sweat, blood, and the constant threat of being turned into a snack by a creature that hasn't evolved in 100 million years, because it never needed to. You think about quitting, about walking away, about finding a job that doesn't involve parasites, lacerations, and the ever-present possibility of being digested. But then you remember there are no other jobs. Not for you. Not for someone born into the mud, raised in the reeds, and trained to swing a sickle before he could spell his own name. So you keep going. You cut. You gather. You bind the stalks with twine made from last week's harvest. You hoist the bundle onto your back, muscles screaming, skin stinging, and begin the long, squelching walk back to shore. You return with a bundle of reeds, because someone has to feed the scribes and the crocodiles. The bundle is heavy. Not because of the weight, though soaked papyrus isn't exactly feather light, but because of what it represents. It's proof that you survived, that you outwitted the snakes, sidestepped the crocodiles, and endured the swamp's 1,000 tiny torments. It's your ticket back to dry land, to the reed weighers and the papyrus pressers, and the scribe who'll never once look up from his scroll to say, "Thank you." You trudge through the muck, each step a squelch, each breath a gamble. The sun is high now, and the air is thick enough to chew. Your tunic clings to you like a second, soggier skin. Your arms itch from the reed cuts. Your legs burn from the leeches. Your back aches from the weight of the bundle. And your soul aches from the knowledge that you'll be back here tomorrow. You pass the shrine to Thoth, the god of writing, wisdom, and conveniently not swamp labor. You nod, respectfully. Maybe he'll bless your reeds. Maybe he'll curse the scribe who complains that they're too short. Maybe he's just amused by the irony that the god of knowledge relies on a guy who can't read to keep his scrolls stocked. You reach the edge of the swamp. The ground firms beneath your feet. The reeds thin. The buzzing fades, slightly. You step onto dry land and exhale, not relief, but permission to stop pretending you're not terrified. You drop the bundle beside the others. The overseer grunts. He doesn't count them. He doesn't ask how many snakes you saw or how close the crocodile came. He just waves you off, already looking past you to the next cutter slogging in from the reeds. You sit. You drink. The water is warm and tastes like copper, but it's not swamp water, so you call it a blessing. You pick at the cuts on your arms, watching the blood bead up like tiny rubies. You swat at a fly. You swat at another. You give up. The flies always win. Around you, other cutters return, some limping, some silent. One with a snake bite wrapped in linen, and a look that says he's not sure if he's lucky or cursed. You nod at them. They nod back. No one speaks. There's nothing to say that hasn't already been muttered into the reeds 100 times. You glance at the bundles, neat stacks of green and gold, destined to become scrolls, ledgers, love poems, tax records. The scribes will write about pharaohs and gods and battles and stars. They'll write about everything, except the man who cut the reeds. Your name won't be inked. Your story won't be told. You'll be a smudge in the margin, a fingerprint on the edge of a scroll, a whisper in the fibers. And still, you'll return tomorrow, because someone has to. Because the scribes need their paper. Because the temple needs its offerings. Because the crocodiles need their snacks. And sometimes, not everyone returns. Sometimes the reeds close behind a man and never open again. Sometimes the water ripples and then stills. Sometimes the bundle never makes it back, but the crocodile does. The others notice. Quietly. They glance at the empty space where a bundle should be. They count heads and come up one short. No one says anything. Not out loud. Not where the overseer can hear. But they know. The swamp has claimed another. The reeds have taken their due. The crocodile has been fed. There's no search party. No ceremony. No name carved into stone. Just a quiet reshuffling of duties, and a new cutter handed a sickle and a sack and told, "You'll get used to it." He won't, but he'll pretend. Because pretending is safer than remembering. The scribes will still write. The scrolls will still be copied. The priests will still chant. And somewhere, in a shaded courtyard, someone will dip a reed pen into ink and write a hymn to the gods. On papyrus harvested by a man whose name no one remembers, whose body no one found, and whose last breath was swallowed by the silence of the swamp. Because in ancient Egypt, even the paper had a price, and sometimes that price was a man. Disclaimer: while this story is rooted in real aspects of ancient Egyptian labor and society, we've taken a few creative liberties, especially with tone, dialogue, and the occasional sarcastic crocodile. We've done our best to stay true to historical facts, but if a detail slipped through the reeds, blame it on the dust in our scrolls. Now, close your eyes. Let the Nile's breeze carry you. The crocodiles are full, the scribes are quiet, and the reeds are still. For now, sleep well, traveler. You've earned your rest.